Hey, deserving listeners, I thought I would watch popular TikToks about psychology. I just typed in the word psychology into the search bar on TikTok, and I thought I would watch the most popular TikToks. Let's watch. This first one is with Jordan Peterson. I will try to remain open-minded.
One of the things that people might want to know who are listening is that if you have a memory that's older than about 18 months and it haunts you, and when it comes up involuntarily, it produces a stress reaction. What that means is that as far as your nervous system is concerned, and so as far as your body's concerned, that danger hasn't gone away. And what's happening is an unconscious alarm system that's looking for pitfalls and holes is warning you that the map that you're using is incomplete in a manner that might enable you to fall into the same hole. And so one of the things that people can do that's very useful is, if you have memories like that plague you, is to bring them to mind voluntarily instead of waiting for them to come after you involuntarily, and then to think through what has changed and what might not have, but also to come up with a plan so that if a similar circumstance arose, you'd be in a better position in one way or another to deal with it.
Okay, so I don't know what he means by maps. There's a lot of different usages in psychology for that metaphor, but the rest of what he said I can get behind, but a major caveat would have to be provided, and maybe he provides that. This is just a clip. Maybe he gave it earlier, or he's about to give it, but I'll give that caveat right now, which is that, yes, when it comes to things like PTSD or other trauma conditions like dissociation, the memory is encoded in such a way that when we recall it later, it can be overwhelming and distressing. That will result in us avoiding remembering the memory, and yet the memory doesn't fade over time. It can even become more intense for us, more distressing to recall, such that we will avoid triggers that will involuntarily cause us to recall that memory. And then this can develop into something like PTSD, and it can be extremely distressing. It's not just like mildly distressing, like, oh, I don't like that memory. It will be all-encompassing, physiological, and it can affect you for hours, days, weeks even. You can have your whole physiology and psychology thrown off. It's really quite distressing. PTSD is a very, very difficult condition. And so a part of the treatment often involves consciously recalling the memory. However, the major caveat is that when we recall these traumatic memories, they can be so distressing as we recall them that it will overwhelm our physiology and our psychology such that we're actually re-traumatizing ourselves. And this often will happen, whether it's voluntarily or involuntary. And the way that it's typically talked about, and the way that I talk about it when I'm treating PTSD and other trauma conditions, is for clients to rate their distress level on a scale from 1 to 10, with 10 being the most distress a person could possibly feel. And the idea goes, and there's a little bit of arbitrariness to the scale, but when typically I'm talking with clients and they're talking about recalling a memory or having a memory being triggered, and they feel distress at the level of 6 and above, then this is in the realm of unhelpful and possibly re-traumatizing. In order to habituate and recover from these memories, the distress has to be kept to a lower level, but some distress has to be occurring in order for habituation to happen. So in a nutshell, listen to all my episodes on trauma treatment and PTSD and whatnot, but the way in which the brain and the body work is that we habituate to things that are mundane to us. Like if you put on socks for the very first time as a young child, it might freak you out because you're like, what is this thing on my foot? But over time, your brain learns to habituate to it. Another example is if you have a litter box for a cat and it smells a little bad, but you live in the apartment, you will habituate to that smell such that you'll not smell that smell at all anymore. and then you leave town for a couple of weeks and you come back and your brain has adjusted such that you no longer have habituated to that smell, and you suddenly smell the litter box. Or another person comes into your apartment and they smell the litter box and they're like, "You don't smell that?" And as someone who's habituated to the smell, so the same physiology occurs when it comes to memories of various sorts, including the traumatic memory. The problem is that with PTSD and other conditions, the processes of the brain and memory and emotion are such that the individual is prevented from habituating. So the cure is to habituate to the memories. The memories won't go away necessarily, but the intensity of the feeling will attenuate to the point of the memory being, mildly distressing, or it's like not a positive memory of yours, but it doesn't cause your whole body to become overwhelmed. So the treatment is what he's talking about. What he's talking about isn't unknown to us. We've known about this for decades. Trauma specialists have known about this. And just generally speaking, psychology has been studying habituation for decades, probably over 100 years. But the key is that people should not be encouraged to just recall traumatic memories, because for some people it's probably safe, but for others it won't be. In that, when I have someone come into my office and they say that they have a traumatic memory that they want to recover from, I have to spend a lot of time assessing whether or not it's safe for them to do so. I learned this the hard way. In the beginning of my career, I was talking more along these lines, where it can be very helpful. And you, as a therapist, feel very honored when a client wants to tell you about something they've never told anyone before, about early childhood abuse. And of course, most therapists, myself included, at the beginning of my career, would be very validating and listen well and would encourage them to say whatever they wanted to and would support them. But what I didn't realize until mid-career, once I looked into the research and I had a mentor that actually walked me through all this, because it's really complicated, is that unless we take precautions, we can actually harm clients. So the thing that I will do is I will assess how traumatic the memory is likely to be, because for some people, their bad memories and stories they've never talked about before are not actually causal of something like PTSD. You can have a traumatic memory that it doesn't either produce the effect of PTSD, or the individual might have PTSD, but the memory isn't associated with that, even though they would term it as a traumatic memory. Anyway, so in order to begin what we call imaginal exposure, which is to imagine the trauma, the memory, and expose yourself. So by exposing yourself over and over again to a stimulus, eventually the brain habituates. I was talking about that. So we want to imagine the trauma and have the individual habituate to that memory. And when we rinse and repeat this enough times with enough of the memories, then the trauma reactivity will attenuate to the point where the person no longer qualifies for the diagnosis of PTSD or some other trauma condition. So when people come into my office, I have to establish two things. One is that they're aware of their distress level in the moment. And two, they have ways of attenuating their distress, of reducing their distress in the moment. We call this emotional awareness and emotional regulation. So you would think that everyone would have that ability to rate their distress level effectively, or to take a guess, but people generally are not. The average person is not, and particularly if you've been traumatized for various different reasons that I won't go into. Also, the average person does not have a robust, effective set of techniques to regulate their distress and their emotions. It's something that for people who aren't traumatized, they don't necessarily need to develop, but for people that are traumatized, they do need to develop it, because as I'm asking them to imagine the traumas, they need to be able to tell me in the moment how distressed they are, because if they're a 6, then we need to slow down. And if they're a 1, then we need to speed up, or we need to go to another memory, because there needs to be some distress in order to find those traumatic memories. If we're getting a 1, then that's not one of the memories we need to habituate to. So we need to find a memory that produces some distress, where the distress level is a 3 or a 4, and the story needs to be said in a pace that will produce 3 or 4, but not more. And if we stick to that distress level, 3 or 4, over time, you will find, either in session or over a number of sessions, that each time the memory is recalled, that distress level will go down. And also, the reason why I need to know that they are aware of this and that they can attenuate and regulate their emotions is that after they leave my office, they will have intrusive memories that will come up, and they need to have a way of evaluating their distress, knowing how to mindfully route their mind around these memories, and also how to regulate their emotions so that they don't traumatize themselves in between sessions, which does happen a fair amount if the clinician isn't doing it right. So I'm trying to describe a very complicated thing in a brief way. So if none of that made sense to you, I apologize. I would listen to my deep dives on trauma treatment. So what Jordan Peterson is talking about right here is half good information, but if people just took that video and said, oh, I have traumatic memories that I should be voluntarily recalling and making new meaning out of, then there are a good number of people that could be re-traumatized and thus later on less likely to seek treatment because they're being given advice along these lines that they're following and it's harming them. And or their symptoms will be increased such that they will be suffering so much that their survival level needs need to be addressed before they can even think about things like therapy or something like that. But anyway, so interesting. All right, well, let's take a break. The rest of this episode is just going to be for members of the YouTube channel. So if you want to see the rest of this episode, become a member. Otherwise, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.